island in Hawaii is invaded by a terrifying virus. Entire communities are infected, and the disease is on the move. It is spread by mosquitoes that feed on human blood. There is no vaccine and no cure. No one is safe from the potentially deadly threat. Now, health officials must eradicate the source before the virus threatens the entire island. Maui is one of the most popular tourist destinations in America. Each year, over 2 million people from all over the world visit the island to enjoy luxury resorts and unspoiled beaches. But tourists only experience a small part of the island's beauty. Over 700 square miles of Maui is covered with untamed jungle. There, the warm temperatures and frequent rain have created a tropical paradise. It is also the perfect breeding ground for a deadly disease. In September 2001, Maui health officials responded to an emergency call. Doctors on the remote eastern side of the island had reported several cases of a bizarre illness.
I think it's just a little bit further up here.
Any idea where we are on the map?
Yeah, I think we're right here.
Where?
We're right
Dr.
here.
Lauren Pang heads Maui's district health office. He and Chris Mills, an epidemiology specialist, made the 2.5-hour drive from their office to the isolated village of
Well,
Nahiku.
it's right down here in Lower Nahiku.
The doctors who first treated the sick patients had never seen these symptoms before. They could not make a diagnosis. But as epidemiologists, Pang and Mills are trained to investigate mysterious infectious diseases.
Sure, this is the place, right?
Yeah, I think so.
If this disease was spreading, they needed to get a first-hand look at the patients and their symptoms.
Hi, Debbie. Oh, hi. Hi, I'm Chris.
Debbie Stoner first contacted public health officials when her entire family became ill.
My husband's not feeling well.
No.
Bruce, people from the health department are here.
Mr. Stoner?
Now,
Talk
her
on the
husband and
telephone?
daughter were sick, and Debbie was worried.
What do you have today? Fever, headache?
Some of those words don't describe how I feel.
Bruce Stoner was suffering from blinding headaches, extreme muscle pain, and exhaustion. His fever had spiked to 104 degrees.
My daughter's upstairs.
Okay, she's not
can you,
feeling well either.
lay
Mills
back
went
down?
to check on the Stoner's daughter, while Dr. Pang examined
You get
Bruce.
sick a lot?
Never get sick.
So this is something unusual for you, huh?
Mahina? Hi, Mahina. I'm Chris. I'm with the health department. How are you feeling?
I'm not feeling very good.
No, you don't look like you're feeling too well. Let me just,
16-year-old Mahina was so weak she could barely move. Like her father, she was experiencing extreme headaches, joint pain, and fever. Mills took a medical history and a blood sample.
Okay.
Maybe the lab could figure out what was making
Mahina,
Mahina's family so
You
sick.
feel better. Talk to you in a few days.
For my whole family to come down with it was very scary because it was a strange illness, and I was the first one to be sick for 6 days. I was in bed for 6 days.
Okay. You right-handed?
Yes.
Okay. So head over.
Now, Mahina and Bruce were also sick. The health officials also took blood samples from the entire family.
Your knees, elbows, ankles.
Mostly my ears.
Your ears.
As Mills examined Debbie, she found an alarming symptom.
Hey, Lauren,
Yeah,
when you get a second, can you come over and look at this?
press this for about a minute. Yeah.
Look at Debbie's rash.
Oh, and we need some light here. Ooh.
Debbie's arms were covered with a strange rash.
I looked like I'd been boiled, and it was so itchy. I could hardly stand it. It came on at night, and it felt like pins and needles when I first got it, like your hands had been asleep and they were waking up. And then it just got so itchy, and there was nothing I could do to stop the itching.
Yeah, and it's a little spotty. You see that? Nothing on the face, though. Yeah?
No.
Okay.
And
The rash was worrisome,
on her palm.
but what Debbie told
Have this over
Pang
the
next
whole body or
alarmed
just-
him.
Is this just a bad sunburn?
Well, I'd heard rumors of people being sick in the neighborhood from my neighbor, and she told me, she goes, Debbie, I've been so sick. She disappeared for 2 weeks and I hadn't seen her, and she told me, Debbie, I've been so sick. It was the strangest thing.
Mills and Pang did not yet know what they were dealing with, but they knew it could be infectious. Geldy, the stoner's neighbor, lived less than a mile away.
Can you just have a seat there? I'll draw your blood first, and then we'll talk a little bit later.
She had gotten sick 2 weeks ago.
Okay, can you put your arm up here?
She still felt weak and tired.
We interviewed her and gathered as much information about her illness, her recent, if she had any recent travel where she could have also gotten sick, and we did draw her blood.
Geldy's symptoms were identical to the stoners.
Did you have a lot of contact with the stoners? Stay overnight with meals together?
No.
Anything like that?
But she had not come in contact with them for over a month.
Okay, hang on to that. Okay. Okay. So you have a fever, just like that. Anybody else sick in Nahiku that you know of?
Yes.
Really? Like you, sick like you, not the flu.
Yeah, same thing.
The pattern was ominous. Pang and Mills feared they were seeing the beginning of an outbreak.
Hold that for about a minute.
By the end of the day, they had seen 4 cases of the mysterious illness.
Okay, I tell you what. Let's just.
They agreed no single
Check out
symptom
how
pointed
wide
to a
it is.
specific
Let's not
disease.
worry about that. They all got the same thing?
Yeah, they all have fever,
Okay,
at
that's a
least,
good
at
start.
least 102, sometimes
Okay.
higher, headache. Debbie had the rash for 4 days. Mahina just started.
But the combination of symptoms worried Dr. Pang.
The fever, when it's associated with a rash, when you don't know what it is, you worry, okay? Because it could be lots of things which could be lethal.
Following protocol, Dr. Pang sent his detailed case notes to the State Department of Health. In Honolulu, on the island of Oahu, Michelle Nakata received the information. As an epidemiology specialist for the state, it is her job to monitor disease outbreaks on the 7 main Hawaiian islands.
It seems like other members of the family are also ill. And from your
Nakata
interview,
reviewed
it
the
sounds
case
like
notes with State
everybody-
Health Director Dr. Bruce Anderson.
Hey, Paul, come on over here for a second. Let me know what you think.
She also consulted Dr. Paul Kitsutani, an expert in infectious diseases.
I just felt bad for her.
As they briefed Kitsutani, Chris Mills called from Maui.
It looks like this guy.
Hi, Chris.
Did you get a chance to look at that fax we just sent you?
Yes, I just got it. I'm just taking a look at it right now.
Great.
Mills had assembled the small staff from the Maui Health Office. They were anxious to hear Nakata's opinion on the cases.
What are your thoughts on what we should rule out?
Have you looked at measles and rubella or even the flu, simple flu?
Well, we haven't, but that would be easy to do.
Leptospirosis is also a possibility.
And I hate to say it, but I think we really need to rule out dengue too.
Oh,
I
okay.
think you should be very alarmed.
Ooh, that's a biggie.
Nakata was
All
worried
right, well, I
about
guess,
dengue fever.
What we'll do is
The Maui team was surprised.
Okay,
If there's anything that we can do to help you, give me a call again. Let me know.
I most definitely will.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye,
Okay.
Michelle, thanks.
Okay,
Thank
see ya.
Dengue fever.
Dengue is a human disease that is carried by the Aedes aegypti mosquito. But in the 1950s, this species had been eradicated from the island. A dengue outbreak seemed impossible and unthinkable. Historically, dengue outbreaks are massive and unstoppable. Thousands can die when the disease strikes. Dengue fever is caused by a virus that attacks the body's immune system. There is no vaccine, and there is no cure. It is often referred to as break bone fever because patients experience pain similar to their bones being broken. Bruce Aquindi suffered with the disease.
I'd say this would be easily 100 times worse than your worst headache you've ever can imagine. You know, right behind the eyes, your head's pounding, you feel like your eyes are going to pop out of your head.
A week after becoming infected, patients break out in a painful rash, a condition caused by veins bleeding under the skin. After 2 more weeks, the symptoms disappear. If dengue spreads unchecked, victims with a repeat infection can develop dengue hemorrhagic fever. With this, patients bleed internally and from the eyes, nose, and mouth. The disease can be fatal. If dengue fever had invaded Maui, Nakata had to determine the extent of the outbreak. She sent a medical alert to hospitals and healthcare officials statewide. She advised them to watch out for patients with rashes, headaches, joint pain, and high fever.
The main reason that we asked them to do this was to get prompt notification of new cases.
At the Maui District Health Department, the small lab wasn't equipped to test blood for dengue. A technician prepared blood samples collected in the remote village of Nahiku for shipment.
Hi, Dr. Payne.
They would send them to a specialized lab at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Puerto Rico.
Tragedy struck in New York City this morning. 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center towers. A 3rd plane hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. We will keep you updated.
Terrorists had struck on September 11th. For the first time in history, air traffic was shut down all over the country.
All departing flights are suspended indefinitely. Passengers should either stay home if they're local residents, or if they're tourists, they should not check out of their hotel.
Maui was cut off, isolated.
It affected us in the sense that we couldn't send out samples to be tested for dengue fever. So it was very challenging.
Pack it up, hold our sample, hold it for CDC.
They were
We'll run
dealing
ours
with a
standby.
potentially
Okay.
deadly outbreak,
Okay, we'll find another test.
and they had to face it on their own. Without lab tests, Mills and Pang went back to Nahiku to examine more of the residents.
Call you, Bruce, if you
First,
come
they
along.
checked on the stoners.
You've been,
Bruce
have you
was
been
starting
here
to
for
feel
long,
better,
Nahiku?
but their daughter Mahina was still weak.
Is any of this tender?
Her fever had subsided, but she ached all over.
Okay, okay.
Just fever.
All right, I'll tell you what.
There
let's
was
go
little her
downstairs.
family
We'll
could
talk
do
about
but give her fluids and some
downstairs,
medication
and,
for the
we'll be
pain.
back. I'll come back.
At the town pavilion, Chris Mills questioned more of the residents.
Who was that?
She believed she might be looking at as many as 20 new cases.
O'Connell. OC?
It was more than the small staff could handle. Maui had an epidemic on its hands.
When the possibility of dengue fever came to Maui, it really overwhelmed our office. So we really needed a lot of help.
Mills asked the state health department to send her more manpower to deal with the epidemic. While flights outside of Hawaii were grounded, flights between the islands were still running. Dr. Paul Kitsutani and a team of epidemiologists arrived from Honolulu. They needed to examine every suspected case, and quickly. An outbreak was unthinkable. If the virus was dengue fever, nobody knew where it came from or where it would strike next. With a suspected dengue fever epidemic on the island of Maui, public health officials were perplexed and overwhelmed. They asked for help from the state health department. A team of epidemiologists arrived on the island. As they made their way into the hot zone, Maui health official Chris Mills briefed the epidemiologists.
We went out and did a community meeting yesterday in Lower Nahiku, but like I said, we set up the town meeting so fast there could be a lot more in the community than even those 20. There's about 150 to 200 people in the community, so that's the number we're looking at.
The population of Nahiku was tiny, and it was in a remote location, far away from the more populated areas. In such a small community, officials hoped they could locate the source of the disease and stop it before it spread. Arriving in Nahiku, they set up a temporary medical station. Worried residents were already waiting. The district health team needed to get a better idea of the number of people who had been sick. Most residents were past the debilitating stage of the illness. But they had all suffered from fever, muscle aches, and a persistent painful rash. Volunteers from the local clinic took case histories and drew blood samples.
Are you okay with needles? No? Okay. You can just don't look, okay? So just a little stick, okay? Okay, good. Good. Hold it. Okay, we're all done.
Within a few hours, they documented over a dozen suspected cases. Mills entered the patient's information into a database. All the symptoms continued to point to dengue fever. In Hawaii, it is not unusual to see isolated cases of the disease.
Great, thanks a lot.
But the victims are always travelers who caught the virus in another country.
Other tropical areas such as Tahiti, Samoa, the Philippines, were all experiencing increased rates of dengue.
From the interviews so far, no one had traveled outside of Maui. They headed to the town church to meet with residents. For now, the outbreak was isolated to the small town of Nahiku. Dr. Pang explained that their blood could not be shipped out for testing. The 9/11 terrorist attack had halted all air traffic. Without laboratory analysis, they could not confirm dengue fever. Still, Pang recommended a massive spraying campaign to protect the residents from the virus. With stakes this high, they couldn't afford to wait for lab results.
I really think we should start spraying pesticides around.
Any pesticides, no DDT, anything sprayed on my property.
We're not going to spray DDT. We have something else to spray which is quite safe.
But residents knew mosquitoes were everywhere.
How are you going to get rid of all these mosquitoes anyway?
We're not getting rid of them all, just the ones around your house.
The response was overwhelmingly negative. The residents of Nahiku lived simply and close to nature. They did not want pesticides to pollute their tropical paradise. Pang was fighting a losing battle. Despite the risk, the townspeople wanted confirmation before they would allow the health department to act.
They're very opposed to spraying any kinds of pesticides in their town, and we really were trying to respect their wishes, but at the same time end the outbreak.
Bruce and Debbie Stoner were the only residents to allow spraying outside their home. They were terrified for their family. If any of them were infected with the virus again, it could lead to dengue hemorrhagic fever, a painful and potentially fatal form of the disease. The risk was too great. The Stoners hoped that spraying would protect them. Health officials went to the most remote corners of Nahiku. During their interviews, they learned that many more people were sick. At one home, Dr. Kitsutani found a woman who said her daughter had come down with a severe case of flu 2 weeks earlier. She was still feeling weak from the disease. Her symptoms were familiar. Fever, headache, joint pain, and a rash.
Mary, we'd like to take, if it's okay with you, you and your daughter Juliet to the building where we set up a station.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you come? What?
So why don't you carry her? Okay.
The girl was too weak to walk to the car. A week after the first case was reported, the team got unexpected good news.
It looked like they lifted the airbags of the mainland.
Began checking passengers in. The first were those from diverted flights. Many of them were international flights, which transportation officials say will return to its origin.
On September 19th, the ban on U.S. air travel had been lifted.
About 7:45 a.m.
At last, the blood samples could be sent to the CDC lab. It would still take them several days to identify the virus. Chris Mills shipped the samples on the first available flight to Puerto Rico. Maui health officials would finally get the answers they needed. And they could call in reinforcements from the mainland. At the CDC's lab in Puerto Rico, the Nahiku blood samples were given top priority. Scientists there specialize in dengue fever. The fastest way to test for dengue is to inject the patient's blood into the most common carrier of the disease, the Aedes aegypti mosquito. Samples of the species are kept frozen for testing purposes. If dengue is present, the virus will multiply inside the mosquito. The insect's tissue is highly sensitive to the virus. Tissue samples are then removed from the carrier and combined with a reagent. Under an ultraviolet light, infected blood cells will glow. Scientists finally had their answer.
Hi, Dr. They're all positive. Your test.
They were facing a full-blown epidemic.
Okay, guys.
It was the worst-case scenario. The Nahiku blood samples had tested positive for dengue fever.
Given how many mosquitoes we have here, and from the history of other countries and tropical areas not ever being able to get rid of it, it was a big deal.
The situation was urgent. There were now 30 documented cases of the disease in Nahiku. The health department was losing the fight.
We were told by the CDC that no one can catch or control a dengue epidemic once it begins. CDC told us, in general, every time you detect one case to your system, there's 200 or 300 more out there undetected. How many do you really
According to the CDC's calculations, the number of victims could now be in the thousands. And they still had no idea how the virus was spreading. The species of mosquito that carries dengue had been eradicated from the island in the 1950s. Had the Aedes aegypti mosquito returned? To answer that question, Maui health officials brought in an entomologist, a scientist who specializes in insects. They needed to catch mosquitoes and examine them to learn whether another species was spreading the disease. Dr. Paul Reeder works for the CDC. He is an expert on Maui's #1 public health enemy, the mosquito.
The first thing that we were interested to know was what mosquitoes are around here. And of course we knew before we came here that Aedes albopictus, which is another species, it's actually now known as the Asian tiger mosquito, was in fact common. And how common we hadn't expected to see, at least not until we came here in Nahiku.
Reeder and his colleague conducted an experiment to measure the mosquito population. The best way to measure the number of mosquitoes is to collect them in an aspirator. Reeder used himself as bait. In minutes, they had collected dozens of the insects. In the lab, they only found the Aedes albopictus, or Asian tiger mosquito. This species carries the dengue virus, but doesn't exclusively feed on humans, and is rarely the cause of an outbreak. This year, breeding conditions had been ideal. The mosquito population swelled. With so much competition for food, Asian tiger mosquitoes were now biting more humans. There were millions of Asian tiger mosquitoes all over the island, and they were carrying a deadly disease. In the fall of 2001, Maui health officials fought to contain an outbreak of dengue fever. Millions of mosquitoes carried the virus. The entire island was at risk.
The dengue fever outbreak is bigger than we thought originally.
State Health Director Dr. Bruce Anderson held a press conference announcing the outbreak. Hundreds of calls flooded the health department. Retired nurses were recruited to help with the workload.
The phones just kind of went off the hook. Calls from the mainland U.S., tourists who had either been here and were worried about, did I get sick, or tourists who were coming, and then our local people who were really upset.
Few people in Maui had ever heard of dengue fever. Panic swept through the community. The Department of Health distributed leaflets explaining the symptoms of the disease and its dangers. They asked residents and tourists to call the health department if they experienced dengue's characteristic pain, fever, and rash. The effect on Maui was immediate and devastating. Island hotels cleared out. Reservations were canceled.
Fever outbreak here on the island.
Hawaii's tourist industry was already suffering from the effects of the terrorist attacks on September 11th. Now, it was also dealing with an epidemic. Officials went back once again to Nahiku and pleaded with residents to let them spray.
Some people were still very opposed to pesticides in their property, but a lot more people were much more open. They figured they'd rather have the pesticides and help prevent other people from getting sick.
Technicians sprayed pesticides around the homes of infected residents. They sprayed the tropical flowers with soap and water. The solution killed the larvae without harming the environment. There was no way they could spray enough to kill all the mosquitoes. But if they could reduce the insect population, they might keep the mosquitoes from spreading the virus. When news of the outbreak hit, the island sold out of insecticide. The health department received an emergency shipment to keep residents and tourists protected.
The public health nurses opened up a booth where tourists and also where a lot of local people who live here pass by, and they handed out information and also wipes or spray if people didn't have bug repellent with them.
But Mills knew they would have to fight them at their source. Pools of water surrounded Nahiku. Insect larvae, the next wave of mosquitoes, were visible on the surface. The stagnant streams were caused by a reservoir, which diverted Maui's water supply to the tourist areas. District health officers requested the water be released. If they flooded the streams, it might destroy the mosquitoes' breeding ground. The reservoir was opened. The water rushed towards Nahiku. A few hours later, Pang and Mills inspected the streams. The water level had barely increased. Their attempt to destroy the breeding grounds had failed. The mosquitoes were multiplying, and the virus was still spreading. Health officials were outnumbered and surrounded. 10 miles away from Nahiku, in the town of Hana, doctors were called in to examine a group of sick high school students. The disease had spread out of the hot zone in Nahiku. Dengue was on the move. For epidemiologists, the high school students provided an important clue. The students had recently visited Tahiti, a country that was also suffering a dengue outbreak. Dr. Paul Kitsutani wondered if the high school students had become infected with dengue fever in Tahiti and then brought it back to Hawaii.
Okay, just a little stick, okay? Ready?
Blood samples were sent to the CDC, where they could compare the strain found in Hana with the strain from Tahiti. As they waited for results, students like Kara Henderson were frightened.
Everybody in Hana was really worried. There were lots of people getting sick, and so everybody was trying to take care of each other.
The outbreak had already spread from Nahiku to Hana, two neighboring communities on the east coast of Maui.
I wasn't surprised to hear of more cases outside of our community because it spread so fast in our community. I was, kind of sad for the people out there, and I wanted to warn them, to watch out, wear mosquito repellent, and wear long sleeves and pants, and don't come down here.
The health department was fighting a losing battle. Roadblocks would keep residents and tourists away from high-risk areas. But, as the CDC had told them, the mosquitoes would be nearly impossible to contain. The swarm of hungry insects threatened both human life and tourism, the main source of the state's economy. State health official Michelle Nakata.
Hawaii is, because it's still part of the United States, it's considered to be a nice tropical, exotic venue. And I think with the dengue fever appearing, the impact was that you lost some of that safety.
Nakata flew to Maui to help the team. But the number of cases continued to multiply.
At the time that I arrived in Maui, we were fighting an uphill battle. They were just getting lots of telephone calls of possible cases, and there was just a lot of work that needed to be done.
Okay, Nahiku, this is where we have the most cases. Hana, here's what we got. These are all confirmed cases, okay? So it looks like we got it to this side for now. Okay?
On September 21st, 2 weeks into the outbreak, Dr. Pang received devastating news. Another suspected case of dengue had turned up outside the hot zone.
Is this true?
Haiku? Okay.
The virus appeared to be moving towards a more populated area. to a town called Haiku.
East Maui is quite isolated, and we kind of drew a line, kind of like drawing a line in the sand. And we said if it crossed over to this area called Haiku, Haiku is very wet, lots of mosquito, and the population is about 4 times as big as the other side. I said if it crosses into here, we're dead. I mean, it'd be like a fire raging out of control.
Investigators drove several hours north to Haiku. Chris Mills and her team had to stop this latest outbreak in its tracks. Technicians from Vector Control, armed with pesticides, had already arrived at the patient's house. Once they got confirmation it was dengue, they would move into action.
Don't look like you're feeling too well. Wow, look at this rash. Is it okay if
A
I-
telltale rash on Sunny Wesner's arm confirmed her worst fears. Once again, dengue had spread to another area. Technicians began spraying around the home.
This is a pamphlet on dengue fever.
Mills gave the family detailed information on how to prevent further infection. She told them to wear long pants and long sleeves outside and to use bug spray. It was important to reduce the mosquito population around the home. But Mills wondered if it was doing any good.
When cases of dengue fever started happening in other parts of Maui, we were really like, it's going to be spread all over the island and we're just going to be living with this forever. And that's kind of a scary thought, not just as a health worker, but as a resident. Thanks, Joyce.
As the disease raged through the village of Haiku, reports of dengue fever came in faster than ever.
You guys got a moment?
Oh, how's it
What's
look?
up? Oh, it just got another stack. Lower Nihiku up to 38.
The team was frustrated and worried.
All right, and grand total?
By late September, they had 60 suspected cases. The Maui officials refused to give up. They knew that if they didn't stop the virus, it could turn deadly. In October of 2001, dengue fever was spreading across the island of Maui. The mosquito-borne disease had been confined to 3 small villages on the island. Now, it was spreading west and threatening more populated areas.
Not only did Haiku start having cases, but far away in Lahaina, with a population of twice 17,000, twice Haiku. Now you have a lot of people, but it's not so wet. And you wonder, well, how did it get there?
Located on the western side of the island, Lahaina is where the tourists vacation and has the highest concentration of people. Because of Maui's fragile tropical environment, they couldn't do aerial spraying.
To store water in containers.
Officials would have to combat the mosquitoes house by house. Their massive eradication effort wasn't working. New cases were reported by the hour. If Dr. Pang and Chris Mills hoped to fight the epidemic, they needed to map where it was spreading.
We called in the Pacific Disaster Center to help with GPS mapping so we could get a good view of where every possible case and confirmed case of dengue fever lived. Out in the Nihiku and Hana area, most of these homes don't actually have physical addresses.
Doctors met with Mike Napier at the Pacific Disaster Center. Napier monitors earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, and severe storm activity in the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. For health officials, this outbreak could be just as devastating. With Napier's help, the team would use satellite imagery to get an overview of the epidemic. But first, they had work to do on the ground. The team assembled in Nihiku. Napier outfitted them with handheld global positioning systems, or GPS units.
Handheld computers, which all have aerial photos loaded.
Working in pairs, their goal was to map each household that had either confirmed or even suspected cases of dengue fever.
Should we also map, say, like the stream, the church, some other points of interest?
Yes, I think landmarks would be very beneficial in the analysis.
This overview would help health officials visualize where climate and vegetation might be harboring concentrations of the mosquitoes.
Okay.
How's it going?
Let me see those blisters on your hand.
In the field, the teams interviewed each patient who exhibited symptoms of dengue. They used the GPS units to record their geographical position.
The state health department used the points to show where exactly the outbreak was occurring and to a certain extent, limit travel to those areas.
At the end of one day, Napier downloaded each team's data into his computer. Health officials would finally see their enemy: swarms of mosquitoes all over the island. They laid out a perimeter around the houses and outlined areas or hotspots to be targeted for mosquito control.
We created 200-yard circles around each hot case, and the reason we did that is because the Albopictus mosquito has a range of 200 yards. Dr. Payne? Dr. Kitsutani?
Now that the teams knew exactly where the mosquitoes were, they targeted areas around the houses of any suspected cases.
All these green dots are the positive cases that we have GPS.
By now, there were 100 suspected cases documented, covering a 70-mile area across the island. Each area had to be sprayed by hand. To prevent further infection, they needed to find more resources, and fast. In October 2001, scientists and health officials on Maui had identified the source of an epidemic: mosquitoes. Millions of them. Nearly 100 cases of dengue fever were confirmed. Thousands were suspected. Dr. Lauren Pang and his team were in a race against time. They had to stop the mosquitoes, or people could die. The outbreak, along with the events of September 11th, threatened to destroy the main source of Maui's economy: tourism. Many workers lost their jobs. Others faced the outbreak of a deadly disease.
You want to cancel? What's that rival day?
Maui was in trouble. The Hawaiian government responded with a bold and practical solution. Hawaiian State Senate Representative Kalani English.
We took people that were unemployed, that lost their jobs from 911, and other unemployed people. We skipped the civil service roles, allowed them to come directly on, hired directly, gave them training, and had them go out to eradicate breeding grounds for mosquitoes. So we created what's known as the Emergency Environmental Workforce.
The newly formed task force was grateful for the work and highly motivated. Their own families were at risk. Day after day, they cut down brush, eliminating the mosquitoes' breeding ground. Pesticide spraying intensified, but so did the infection rate. There were now over 100 confirmed cases of dengue. Chris Mills was worried.
It was scary as a health worker. We just didn't know if we were going to be able to handle it or actually get rid of it.
A dengue epidemic had never been successfully contained. But all across the island, residents pitched in to help.
An empty garden pot, 1
A new series of public service announcements educated them on the dangers of dengue.
A clogged rain gutter, 1,000 mosquitoes. An uncovered wheelbarrow, 10,000 mosquitoes.
Most importantly, they learned how to stop the mosquitoes from breeding.
Standing water do you want around your home? Do your part to end dengue.
Residents checked around their homes for stagnant water where mosquitoes lay their eggs. Those who had been sick were particularly concerned. They were terrified of getting a repeat infection. After months of work, the number of cases of dengue fever in Maui dwindled and then stopped.
At one point, we were projecting literally hundreds of thousands of cases, which would have been a worst-case scenario. As it turned out, we had just over 100 cases, and the problem was largely kept under control.
Since the first case in Nahiku, scientists at the CDC had tested hundreds of blood samples and found the source of the outbreak.
In this case, we found the Hawaiian dengue virus was most closely related to the Tahiti virus, which we got from the same year, and more distantly related to the Samoan dengue one of the previous year. So our conclusion is that the most likely origin of the Hawaiian virus was Tahiti.
For the people who had been infected, recovery was long and difficult. But the quick action of the health department averted a disaster.
As soon as the health department found out about it, they acted on it immediately. They came out the next day, and they were very interested and very detailed, gave us a lot of personal attention, and started meetings with the community right away. They really made me feel more secure about the whole thing.
8 months after Debbie Stoner reported the first case of dengue fever on Maui, the outbreak was contained.
We declared the outbreak to be officially over in April. That was about 2 months since the last case was reported. We figured that given that mosquitoes live for about a month, if it were no longer circulating in the mosquito population, then there would be no longer any risk of transmission.
Miraculously, there had been no fatalities.
I think we were successful in stopping or having an effect because of the early response. And I think we had an early response because we had education and people told us, so we knew where it was and we could respond very quickly. So a lot of people said, how can I personally help? So breeding site control and all that. So we had a very, very motivated, educated community.
Health officials, doctors, scientists, and the public had achieved the impossible. Working together, they had contained an epidemic, defeated a disease, and restored Hawaii as a safe tropical paradise. For the first time in history, Hawaiian public health officials had stopped an outbreak of dengue fever.